So this is my commentary on the Proverbs. I'm continuing now with part 2 of chapter 23. It happens to be late at night, as I'm currently speaking, and I had just finished the previous episode. And so the voice that is coming through now was the voice of episode past. And I feel a particular way today, at this moment. A bit strange. A bit of a surreal type of experience. There's a longing for the practicality. There's a longing for certainty. There's a longing for precision. And the proverbial pursuits, although we may come to precise definitions of words, is nothing like the type of mathematical precision that my mind is hungering for. Now, I think there is an aspect of what I have said that is unfair, because surely the mind can do much in the exploratory space, in the space of ideas, in the space of the hypothetical. But no matter, I will continue. So we are going to begin here with verse 17. Let not your heart envy sinners, but be you in the fear of the Lord all the day long. And so since today is kind of a strange day, it's a bit of a Lutheran day, it's a day of challenging the mind's central axioms. Not necessarily that there is a faltering of faith, but rather a necessary, what I might say is a necessary disposition or state of mind that is wanting of a reorientation, a different perspective. And so I will try to bring this spirit into my interpretation. Let not your heart envy sinners. So this is a good opportunity to discuss and to consider envy. What might I say of envy without looking at a dictionary definition? When I think of envy, when I think of myself in a situation where I would consider an envious thought or behavior, perhaps it comes, to whatever extent. At times I've noticed it in the professional context, in which there may be somebody who has many distinctions, credits to their name, let's say on their business card or whatever. And I think about this person, I think about where my credentials are, not necessarily an overly judgmental sort of thing, even though it may sound like it. It's a brief reflection, but nonetheless, there is this feeling, the sense of curiosity, wondering about these distinctions, and wondering about how much they actually hold in terms of the true value sense. And I think, at least I have to wonder, if the precipitation of that thought is not because, rather than saying, all of those distinctions and credentials must have taken a fair amount of effort to achieve and to acquire, my mind, in the true contrarian way, goes towards the negative. But then again, in 100 years from now, I'm sure the people then will consider the age that I live in now to be an age of institutional instability, the nominal age. And so perhaps my thoughts are not necessarily unwarranted, but all the same, I shouldn't mince words. In the darkest of moments, I find myself trying to downplay the value of somebody else's achievements in order to make myself look or feel better in the absence of the achievements relative to another. And I think that this is a form of envy. It is the secret desire of somebody else's accomplishments, but lying to myself and saying that those accomplishments are not what you want. You don't need them to be better. Or the accomplishments are not good things. Rather, these accomplishments that you see in the hands of another are not good things. Now, this word envy, from the Latin, the etymological root, we have the prefix, or we have the word, I should say, invidia, or invidere, prefix meaning against, invidere meaning to see. So we have against and to see. There's a bit of truthfulness, I think, to what I said here, that in the sense that there is this justification against somebody else's achievements. In the absence of my own, there is this sort of desire to see against, not to witness it, so I don't have to come to terms with this perhaps it's an egotistical hold onto something that it wishes to hold over others. Sort of an unfortunate way to see the world. Now, surely I would have to say that this is not something that occupies my mind the majority of the time, for which I'm thankful for, but as I've said, in my darker moments, I think that this does come to find me. Now, this word envy, the definition for it is a feeling of discontent or resentful longing aroused by someone else's possessions, qualities, luck, or achievements. So I suppose I'm not too far off. Let not your heart envy sinners. Now, this concept of sinners is a difficult one, and I think that my introduction to this episode is a good one to enter into this conversation about the sinner, because within justifications, within perhaps justifications as it relates to human affairs, social affairs, cultural affairs, there is this lack of precision that is so frustrating. The whole of this questioning that surrounds our experience, and how difficult it is to come to a conclusion, to come to some sort of accurate sense of what God is, what the divine is. We go on. We take one step after the other, 1 foot in front of the other. And by sinners, even though many of us may not be religious or believing or faithful, we still have the ability to identify and to fill the word with some meaning. Even within this nominal age, sinners has a meaning. And much like this envy. There's a sense of contrariness within, I think, the heart of the sinner that is to go against, to see against the way that things ought to be. They are the participants against the will of the standard, the highest standard of human flourishing. That is quite difficult, because there are plenty of different situations, there are plenty of difficult situations for which man must make lofty sacrifices. Not only in terms of his own internal experience, his egotistical self, but also more difficult collective sacrifices. And all of us are considered to be these sinners, these people that make mistakes. And surely it's okay to be a sinner. Willfully, perhaps not. We should all aspire to good standards. But within the heart, within this factory of desire and emotion, to envy the sinner, to wish, or to be resentful that we do not possess their ability to behave in the way that they are. This would mean that our mind is desirous of, the sinful behavior, the contrary behavior, the behavior of injustice, as we can imagine it. And I'll have to put the cynical mind at bay, not to be overly compassionate for the situations in which, as I've said, all of us are sinners, to most who are unaware of the mistakes that they make. There's a large aspect of this that just goes beyond, certainly beyond our control, but it is something that we deal with, no doubt. So simple enough to understand. The heart, again, the engine, the filter through which the soul experiences this reality. If it is to envy that sinner, it is to necessarily reduce its experience. But be in fear of the Lord all the day long. And by this, it means that the highest standard by which we are able to conceive, the highest standard by which we are able to participate in, we fear going against that standard because of the consequences. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the mind will be trapped within the prison of, potential consequences or potential risk, but surely one can find themselves in a spiritual hypochondriac type of situation. I think what we are prompted to consider here is being mindful of the steps that we take. Be mindful of the boundary between what is acceptable and what is not. And to be cautious of the risks that are associated with that which is unacceptable to a standard that is beyond us. For surely there is an end, and your expectation shall not be cut off. Oh, the endings. When I first read this verse, what came to mind was the finality. Perhaps we can say totality. I'll stick with finality. My mind was after that unification the ultimate ending of something. The thought really didn't land anywhere in particular, and yet the heart found it appropriate to produce an emotion not unfamiliar to me, but it produced a type of longing, a melancholy. And I think that the response to this ending invoked in me these types of emotions because the ending, the finality of something, the concreteness of an all-seeing, all-knowing God was quite narrow in my initial conception. For surely there is an end. I think too often in my mind, especially when I was younger, but still to today, I find myself thinking about the ending, about the point at which everything comes to rest, where I have achieved that point in life where the aspect of suffering is now over. Now, of course, this is ridiculous. That is not to say that suffering is to be sought after. In a sense it is, but it is just like the ending. It is a moldable thing, at least it seems to me. The ending certainly implies a standard. The reason that we fear God is because there are identifiable boundaries. But the way in which the boundaries are integrated into our lives, I don't think is as easy to discern as my initial thought. Now, the conception, I think, is also an interesting one. This fear of God because of everything that is around us, the potential of the end of the end of that boundary, or the border of that boundary for which if we cross it we transgress. If we transgress, we commit an error, we commit a sin. We have done something against the wishes of the Almighty. This type of thinking I don't partake in. I think it's too simplistic. Some boundaries, many boundaries, I think, are there for us to be to interact with. Transgress, perhaps sometimes. As we do, we learn. It is the situation for every man to learn from his mistakes. If he does not, he will continue. At some point, he will not be able to continue. He will find an error in his ways. If he doesn't find the error in his ways, he will die with his mind fixed upon that selfish delusion upon which he built his life. For surely there is an end, and your expectation shall not be cut off. For something to be expected, if I am to be expecting a visitor at a particular time, I know that it is likely that they will show up at my door at a given time. To some degree, I depend on them. My attention is oriented towards them. In the strongest sense of this expectation, we are implying some standard by which we know it will always be on time. This person will always arrive at the door. Now, I'm having some trouble here conceptualizing this. My mind just went on a bizarre daydream, I suppose, of various different endings of the endings that I've experienced in life. Of the ones that come to mind, many of them are not pleasant. It doesn't mean that all of them are not pleasant, it just means that the ones that stick out are not pleasant. There are plenty of things that have ended that have been positive. But I go back to what I was saying earlier about this central point and being dissatisfied with that conception and that analogy. While I do deeply respect the image of the mountain, and at the peak we have that divine logos, that center place for all of intelligibility. And within that realm, within that peak, I understand that expectation, that place will always be there for all of us, even if we, the limited beings that we are only able to ascend to that mountain to a certain point. We all know it to be there, because we can see it from where we are. Some perhaps have a better vantage point than others. And just as I understand that this peak is there, I understand that the aspects of the mountain, the path of the mountain, is also there. That this tireless standard does not cease because it extends itself outward from that divine peak. The expectation shall not be cut off. It is continuous. Hear you, my son, and be wise, and guide your heart in the way. So we have to remember here that this is a prompt. It is vague, yes, but we are meant to paint with it. We are given the canvas, we are given the brush, and we are given the prompt. It is up to us to paint what's in front of us. Paint upon the canvas, perhaps I should say. Okay. So there's something that I want to introduce this verse with. Now, I understand that last little segment of audio was an introduction of sorts, that prompting to consider that we are the artists that will be painting upon this canvas. But it's more than that. It has to do with, I think, an aspect of faith. An aspect that I was reflecting on before I started recording tonight. And I think that this matter of faith, the way in which we go about our lives and orient ourselves to something that we find worthwhile, purposeful, meaningful, the things that we sacrifice for, the things that we believe to be right. All of these things, I think, involve faith. And there's a funny thing about life that I have been thinking about lately. How much like in the previous verse, we were talking about the end. And I think that there are many endings within one person's life. Endings that may not be totalizing, but endings that represent all levels, all scales of experience. In particular, I believe that I'm going through a type of an ending right now. Perhaps it's a certain chapter of life that is closing. Perhaps I can boil it down to a series of feelings. I can qualify it in that regard. But when these things happen, when change comes about us, I think it's important for us to hear. It is important for us to listen. There are a lot of factors that are coming into mind right now. I think of, the state of our economy. I think of the way in which we perceive the mechanisms of our economy, the way in which we perceive the divine, old and new, the way in which we orient ourselves to the future, the way in which I orient myself and keep myself honest, faithful, and the degree to which, when I make a mistake, I am able to recognize it and correct it. For me, at this time, this ending, I think signifies an understanding that I have approached problems in a certain way. Now my approach, perhaps my attention, is growing a bit stale, stagnant, and it is time to open. It is almost as if my experience, my mind, goes through these periods of contraction and then inflation. In the contracted periods, there is this hyper-intense focus. It filters out irrelevant details seemingly well, at least in the interim or in the meantime between these cycles. And eventually, there becomes like a stale pool of water. It becomes stagnant, and I have to reorganize, open up again, see things from a different perspective or view. And when this happens, this sort of stagnant pool of water becomes filtered and rejuvenated, nourishing rather than poisoning. But I've noticed, both in matters of interpretation and reflection on verses, and also in terms of everyday life, the continual reorientation to what is good, what is true, that which keeps me sane, healthy, happy, content. And of these terms, I don't necessarily mean in the excess. I don't imply in the excess. I mean that they are dosed appropriately. There are sacrifices that are made such that I don't want to say worthy of the fruits that are brought to bear, but it is more so that the fruits that are brought to bear because of sacrifice, because the seed at one time was planted. Some sacrifice had been made prior, such that I can enjoy this fruit down the road. And such a tiring and exhausting process it is to continually be this farmer within the intelligible landscape. I'm not a physical farmer, but I am a farmer of the, it's hard to say exactly what, of the civilized world. Not to say that the farmer is not part of the civilized world. Of the urban world, I think that would be a better way to say it. As much as I dislike the urban environment and what the urban culture is turning into, I plant the seeds in that conscious space to offer some service to somebody. And we all participate in this interesting, diverse manner. But to move a little bit farther into this, the reflection on not just the ending, but the listening is fundamental to recognize the state of the cycle and to expedite it if necessary. For I do think that there are times in which our period of listening is not dependent upon our will or our desire to have things come to us, but rather it is dependent upon life to show it to us, and we have to be patient. Within our patience, and not necessarily juvenile patience or naive patience, but true patience, such that we take opportunities when we see them, and when we hear something that we ought to take in, we accept it and integrate it. This is an aspect of being wise. It is the connection of things together and its integration. To guide one's heart in the way. There have been many times, this is a difficult thing, I've mentioned it already, but this notion of sacrifice. My heart is this thing that is in constant flux. I described it as the industrial machine of the conscious experience that turns out these emotions, these desires. They have some strong base, primeval quality to them, and they are paired readily to reason. Perhaps reason produces them, or they produce reason, or prompt reason. I suppose one can ask the question, I have this ability to hear, so what does it mean? I'm being prompted to hear, and yet I'm not being instructed what to pay attention to. But this is exactly the point. It is a prompt and consideration of the general state of arousal that one must be in order to even attempt to grasp at something that is worthwhile, that is something that can be used in the building of a spirit, used in the, I don't necessarily want to say building of a soul, because this is, I think, something innate to man, but it is the expansion, perhaps, of soul. It's the expansion of that connectedness to just the bedrock intelligibility, the basic relationship that one has to that which is. And to that which is, it is a difficult one because we orient ourselves to that which is in relationship to the constraints placed on our own conscious experience. That we interface with reality at a certain level, and so therefore all of our meaningful objects that we produce, all of our meaningful pursuits exist at that level. Of course, we are quite interesting beings, and we augment our experience quite a lot, and we have changed quite a lot, I think, over the millennia. And this change, this evolution, it seems to be continuing. I think of artificial intelligence as the next step, but what I see in front of me, this book, this Bible, it is a massive tool by which man has propelled himself, I think, through the ages, that has kept some stake in the hurried fluttering of a piece of canvas, this cloth canvas of our conscious mind, such that it will not just be uprooted and float away in the wind to who knows where and for what purpose. And surely there are many that would critique this, and perhaps they have a right to. No tool or technology is perfect. No man is perfect. But all the same, I think it depends on what level, because the floating away is a certain type of end, as I've mentioned. But this type of end is on the scale of Noah. This is the potential destruction of civilization, again, of man's orientation to himself, but also to things that are truly valuable. And I think there's an ease of thought that we are afforded in the first world when we consider the virtues of our society and the way that we act and behave with one another, and that in the state of nature, while we may maintain strong bonds as we are social creatures, the affordances socially that we have now, I don't think would be anywhere near the same. And given enough destitution, hunger, starvation, mere survival, I think the mind would be certainly reduced. In absence of all cultural materials, it certainly would be and would have aspects of itself that would be destroyed and just lost forever. Now, in other ways, man can be uprooted, whether it be a group of people from a country or a particular society, and leave and go somewhere else. I think of Elon Musk's mission to go to Mars and establish a base there. This sort of thing is not the same. It's certainly starting over. But it is gathering a select group of people, highly qualified, intelligent people, to partake on a mission and a journey to build a new type of society. A new type of society that is built upon the supports that which was given to them. And of course they modify it and they change it as they see fit. The type of ending when the supports perhaps have become inefficient, weakened, and a reorientation necessary. Hear you, my son, and be wise, and guide your heart in the way. And so I'm beginning to understand, I think, this verse a little bit better. What it means to hear. It implies patience. It implies that certain things that we had at once held dear may appear to us different when the reorientation occurs. Within the very depths of wisdom, we find that connectedness and that binding of things together. Within this binding, within this unity or unification, we find perspective, we find context. And there's nothing like a healthy dose of perspective and context to allow us to see a bit differently, allow us to see maybe a little bit more clearly. And that the anxieties that had caused us to run, to be inattentive, to take the short route, suddenly become meaningless, and that it is not about the short route. It is not about the vain or superficial that satisfies. It is about that which is true, taking the appropriate path, taking the path of righteousness, taking the path that is right. And I don't mean to go down the vague rabbit trail here. There are so many experiences that I experienced today in which I can apply this. There are many instances in which I had taken a shortcut, in which I should have taken the long road. I should have explained something, articulated something a little bit stronger. I should have been more prepared. I should have bolstered my voice with a certain character and strength, such that I would garner the attention of those that are seeking my opinion. All of these sorts of things. Now this is quite internal, but it's related. It is related to, I don't want to say the outside of myself. I don't want to sound self-axial, revolving around myself. So perhaps I should rephrase my observations of things. My observations of the experiences, my observations of the way in which things are, independent of my own desire to satisfy the selfish anxieties. In this light, the light that tells me that my own selfish anxieties are not the primary voice that I should be listening to, but rather that which actually calls me to attention, the problem or task that I'm tasked with at that particular moment, that the solving of that thing to completion and to perfection is where my attention ought to be. And of course, it's a difficult thing to do, but it's a matter of faith that we say that we are committed to doing such a thing. This is the path. Be not among wine-bibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh, for the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. Okay, so this is a two-part, or a two-verse lead-in. Verse 20, be not among wine-bibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh. So let's start with that first part. Be not among wine-bibbers. Bibbers is not a word that I've heard before. So a bibber is a person who drinks regularly. That's not too surprising, given the context. Be not among wine-bibbers. Now, this sort of thing makes sense to me. Of course, it's like always with the Proverbs, it's a matter of making sense at a particular level that's going to do some good and actually have some longing and lasting impact on my life. So the level of reflection needs to be a little bit more than just a dictation. not to hang out with people that drink a lot of alcohol. So the question is why? Why don't we hang out with these people? Why is it bad to be a person who drinks regularly the wine? Well, like with many things, I think this has to do with attention. It is the perversion of attention. And particularly with alcohol, an excess of alcohol, surely. I think that there's a case to be made for moderation. Temptation sneaks itself into the smallest of crevices, however. This excessive drink, it turns one's attention, as I try to recall what this sort of thing felt like. It's been some time since I've been to the point where I would consider my experience essentially a waste of time after drinking a fair amount of alcohol. And it's not to the point where I don't remember, but surely that is the extreme in which a person drinks themselves so much that they are unable to remember anything that happened when they were conscious and behaving. This sort of thing is a road to literal emptiness, because the mind is just not active. It is completely empty when the sober mind returns. And there's an interesting contrast here between the sober mind and the inebriated mind. And within the inebriated mind, of course, there's a scale. There's a scale from 1 drop all the way up to not remembering the experiences that are had. And at some point, I think we can honestly say that the experience of life is being negatively impacted by the amount of alcohol that is being consumed. I think it's reasonable to suggest that 1 drop is not going to be the threshold for that. Perhaps not even 2 or 3 drinks. Now 2 or 3 on a regular basis, probably. That continual distortion of experience, I think in the long-term sense, have an effect that is similar to that blackout period, because over time it just generally diminishes one's quality of experience, their capacity to attend to things. And on the flip side, if we say 2 or 3 in a reasonable amount of time, let's say once a month, in which there's adequate time to recover from it, the alcohol sort of becomes like an ending in and of itself. It's an opener in a way. It allows the mind to consider things a bit differently. And in that way, there's this good element, but of course it's opening, and it's letting a lot of things in. Perhaps it's not the most controlled opening. It is not the type of opening that has been got through experience and through the sort of agricultural example of the farmer of mind, living through experiences, going to work day in and day out and finding that things are becoming stale and that they have to make corrections. This is a strange form of celebration, maybe we could say. It's a strange form of letting go, letting loose. But again, to return to this, be not among wine bibbers, we are being warned against that potential altering of attention off of its natural axis. The natural axis being necessary for the mind to understand where it is in relationship to other things, whether it be people, objects, ideas. Be not among wine-bibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh. Now, what does the second half of that verse mean? Riotous eaters of flesh. Now, it sounds like that this is just sort of an extension of the alcohol example, where the wine-bibbers are the alcoholics, and the riotous eaters of flesh are the obese, the gluttonous. For in the next verse we have, "For the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags." So similarly, this drive towards gluttony, this constant consumption, is an attempt, I think. I have a good friend that I think has an issue with this. That's not really a judgment on his character. He's a very strong, soulful individual. But no person is perfect, obviously. But to the degree that there is a failure, it is through this path. It is the riotous eater of flesh. And I think that even examining my own life, in which I have these tendencies, they are not the gluttonous per se. It's not gluttonous to the point of, like in the example of the wine bibbers, the sort of alcoholic. But I understand the general sentiment that if taken to the extreme, how that would affect productivity, how it would affect attention, how it would influence my relationship to my body. So today is a new day, and with every new day it takes me a little while to come back up to speed, to remember exactly what it was that I was talking about, to enter back into that flow state. Now, I believe that I had established for myself a fair understanding of this drunkard, the glutton, that there is this relationship between that perversion of attention and of the decline in willful, purposeful experience. For the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty. I've spoken many times. This is a pattern that is seen often in the Proverbs. It is not just seen in the context of the drunkard and the glutton, but the way in which one comes to poverty, the way in which one comes to lacking, it seems in the end to be quite similar. Now, what I mean by that is anything, really, whether it be the drink, the food, or the general disposition, the mind can find itself in a state of wanting, but only wanting enough to quiet that voice. Now, I suppose I have to be careful here about where I step, because it is through our strivings that we seem to attempt to quiet the voice, or to satisfy the voice, or to answer the call, perhaps is a better way of expressing it. That voice that is from within, perhaps we hear it from without. It is a call towards something meaningful and purposeful. It is a call towards a sense of innocence in our dealings, such that we feel satisfied, that we are connected to something that is bigger than ourselves and yet includes ourselves. There are many things that can disrupt one's goings in life. They can find the way difficult, jagged, unproductive. Again, it may not be the drink or the food. It can be a pattern of behavior. It could be a mindset. All of these things have the capacity to lead one on the path of poverty. Now, this sense of poverty, there is the economic distinction, no doubt, having little value. The type of poverty that I usually like to reflect on, in the proverbial sense, is the type of poverty that extends beyond just the monetary. Because I have mentioned many times that the monetary is just that medium of exchange for value. That doesn't necessarily mean that one is impoverished if they lack money, in the sense that they lack that currency, that they lack the ability. They are impoverished, but they may be wealthy in other ways. So the way in which my mind conceptualizes this is a bit broader than just the concept of monies, of having the material asset. But of course, material assets are a translation of cognitive value, or of spiritual value, however we want to define it. And it is a complex matter. It is a matter that is formed over time, built over time, that is the accumulation of assets. In the financial sense, these assets, I think, occupy different spaces. We think of financial assets, we think of hard assets. These things are, spiritual versus physical, but yet there is a domain in which they come together, because an asset is something that has value, it's something that holds value. There are just different ways in which our experience, or at least our society and our culture, has found to embody or to hold this value. Ultimately, in the human context, our value is where we place our attention. It is, in a fundamental sense, of necessity's sake, it is the satisfaction of desires that are necessary for life. Number one, it is the fulfillment of social needs. In the perverse sense, there are all sorts of ways I think that the mind can find itself into a gluttonous trap, the trap of the drunkard, by which the creative engine, that is the mind and experience of man that creates value and puts it out into the world, whether that value be an iPhone, whether that value be planting a seed in the earth such that it will grow in the future for food to sustain him. I think I can convince myself that what is truly valuable here is the orientation of that attention and the fulfillment of the thought, the fulfillment of the dream, the fulfillment of the imagination, the bringing down of heaven to earth to raise that material standard for which man can exact to execute his purposes, to fulfill that cup of meaning that he has within his spirit. And to come to poverty is to come to this absence of this volume of the cup that I have just described, that finds itself within that the generative engine is no longer capable of fulfilling the needs or fulfilling that cup, for example. And the question is, well, what significance does this cup truly occupy? Well, it is the point. It is the expression of that divine logos through us. It is the way in which we find love. It is the way in which we find something that is truly valuable. And here, in my mental image, I see a graduated sense of this, because there are plenty of lower goods, and yet we still call them goods. I still call them goods. And in my mind, they, much like this picture of the mountain that has a central peak and a broad base, these lower goods are all integrated and connected in some way to that highest good. And the poverty, depending on where we are in that mountainous scale, within that graduated scale, knocks us down, it pours us out, it decreases our elevation. We fall, we stumble backwards to a lower level, some lower good. Now what I wonder to myself, firstly, is of my action, of my attention, of my behavior, how much of it is oriented towards that which I can truly conceptualize as the highest good? I think of the situation in which man finds himself doing something in life. In the modern world, we have this career path that we are all engaged on and engaged in. And our careers are often for life. Thankfully, we have the ability and the opportunity to switch if we need to, of course under the conditions of profound sacrifice in many cases. But this aspect of doing something with one's life, it becomes quite complicated. The sacrifices and the affordances that are provided by such things, that a man can do something with his life and yet feel completely hollow and empty on the inside, even if the pursuit is just. That there is something within him that feels as though his efforts are not directed where they ought to be, despite that efforts directed in that direction, again, are just, are worthwhile, are purposeful to some standard. Now, this is not really a matter of the highest standard, because I think we can make a good argument that those who devote themselves to the service of others are aiming towards a very high standard. And yet there are those that may aim to that standard, but do not fulfill the role as they ought, because their heart is not in it, is not wed to their reason, that then they become imperfect actors. And it is within the imperfect act that we find that the attention is not oriented towards the highest good. It almost is a paradox. It is oriented towards something that is just reason for the sake of reason, perhaps. It is not including the aspect of self that would flourish in another environment. And this raises all sorts of questions. This is a sort of a Protestant question. Well, surely there is one standard, but at what cost? What do we sacrifice? At what level of transformation, or is it even possible that a man can be transformed to where the cup of his spirit, the aspect of his wealth, in the sense of his life, is benefited by one thing and not another, despite the hierarchy of goods being in front of him. Now, I think that, although this is quite Protestant, that we are examining this landscape of possibility, I think that there is sufficient variability for which one mind, perhaps because of the structure of that mind or because of the context in which the mind was raised, or a combination of the two, it is suited for a particular task. If we take one person and another, one person is more jovial, personable than another is reserved, quiet, introspective. These individuals, they may pursue the same career path, and yet one may flourish while the other may, in the individual sense, in the internal sense, in the intimate sense, suffer greatly. Now, I think that within the suffering, there are ways in which one can find a solution to the problems that they have. But I also believe that, almost in a peripheral sense, in the outskirts of town, or this margin that exists at the margin, but also at the center, because it is necessary for man, because of his, it's hard to say exactly, maybe his fallenness or his variability, that even within the center, there is this room, there is this door that we open, that some of us have the key to open it, that we understand that we have found something that is very good, and yet for whatever reason our interface with that good cannot hold us. And so we must have that door available, the margin within the center, through which we can go into it. And because we began at the center, we have some grounding point in place. And just because we go through a door doesn't really mean that we're not still at the center, because in a geographical sense we are at the center. I can go from my room to my living room, and yet there's a different feeling that my living room is not my room. Of course, it's my house, but it is not. I do not have the same feeling, the same level of intimacy that I do in my room versus out in the living room, or versus out in the community, or versus out beyond the state in which I live, or out beyond the country in which I live. Now, I'm not making a case for comfortability as the highest of goods, but I am trying to make a case for the placing oneself in the conditions that are necessary in order to thrive and to succeed. And there's a strange catch-22, because in some sense, man is formed by his experiences, that he must commit to something whether he likes it or not. So it's not so much a matter of liking. It is a matter of discipline, a matter of faith. But again, there comes that Protestant line. Well, what about the man that finds himself faithful? He understands that he can't enjoy everything in life, and yet he knows that what he is doing is not the path to goodness or glory. It is not the thing that he is able to marry himself to. Thankfully, there are, even at each particular level in that mountain of goods, there are a variety of goods at every level. This is my personal opinion. And he may find himself cognitively capable of achieving and of seeing at a certain level. And given that he is at that level, it is up to him to find that good that he is allowed to express the fullest of his soul, because the soul is the expression of that divine logos. And the expression of that divine logos is best expressed when it is in line by this, this sort of independent agent acting to find where it belongs, where its home is. It is best when it is in line with the way, which is this sort of mythical path by which he walks. It is best when the soul, again, that conduit, that junction between that ineffable, permeating awareness, base level quality, distinction, intelligibility, from that arena through to the independent agent, through the soul, the conduit, and then through the adjustment of that being through his heart and his reason, essentially back to that source, that divine source. And what guides him is that source to some level. Of course, his reason and his will gets in the way to change, to disrupt, to modify, to come to move away from. For the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty. Now this whole reflection is because of this. And drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. It is because of this at once simple but also profoundly complex way in which a man can find himself impoverished but also fulfilled and happy. That at least in the extreme situations we understand that drowsiness, this cause to move one away from the very pursuit, not to mention the actual pursuit of the sacrifice and of the learning and of the true integration of one's being with that ineffable, with that flow, with the way in which life comes, with all of the pain that every potential ting against that wall of the standard of our experience is brought back to us. That resonance is integrated with our decisions in life. It is made harmonious with our attention, with our behavior. And rather than something that sounds sharp and painful, it is more something that is soothing and relaxing. This is like a true, transformation. Of course, we can have this sort of situation in which one will find themselves in true harmony, relaxation, because they've stuck that needle in their arm, because they have eaten that cupcake, whatever the case might be. I'll leave that verse there. Eventually we are going to come back to this through line of that which is its relationship to the soul as it intersects with the will of man through the way in which he experiences reality, and then back out to his direction, to his way, to his purpose, and ultimately where that lands. Hearken unto your father that begat you, and despise not your mother when she is old. Okay, so some big patterns here that we have to think about. First, I want to define this word hearken. I have a basic understanding, I think, of what it means. Again, I think it's another attention orienter. And of course it is. To hearken means to listen. So, let's think for a moment what it means to listen. I mean, to truly listen, to truly hear, not just to take in information, and not just to superficially reflect on something. To truly listen to something, I think, means something quite profound. It is to take something with us, to commit it to memory, and more than just memory. Because I think there are certain levels of memory. The memory of the interaction that I had today, or of the layout of the building that I work in, which I am there day in, day out. What matters more to me than that is the interaction that I have, the broader interaction that I have, perhaps. Now here I get into some trouble because of the orientation of my attention. Because I ask myself, well, it is certainly possible that the layout of this building has a beauty and an interesting quality in and of itself, and who am I to say that I should not be attending to that? And I also think that the truly meaningful things are at least the things that I will take with me, are the interactions that I had with the people in that space. And the thing is, just like I mentioned about the multiple goods that exist at a particular level, both of these are possible, so this is difficult. Now, I say this in the context of listening, but this is extended into the process of seeing. But in the context of listening, the example would be the same. It would be, I've had this conversation often with people. The question is, do you prefer to listen to music for the lyrics or for the melody? And some may say melody, some may say lyrics. But there's something about in my experience of music, even if something is lyrical in nature, I'm listening to the melody of that speech rather than to the content or the meaning of the words. And it is not that I am wrong, I think, to experience in this way. It's not necessarily that I am sinning by thinking about something that is other than man's purposeful attempt to relate himself to the world through words, to pack his value through that. But of course the melody that he produces is quite valuable, apart from his lyrical capacity. And even if it wasn't just his lyrical or melodical capacity, perhaps it was something observed and witnessed in nature, independent of all instrumentation. This also would be a good for one to orient their attention to, for they can discover a lot by orienting their attention in that domain. Now, in a specific manner, we are directed to the attention of the Father. And while we understand that there are goods to be had all over the place, for which we can interface with the world, to find ourselves situated within, the role of the Father is quite interesting. And we could say at the outset that there is a standard, there is a way in which fathers ought to act. There's a way in which they ought to relate themselves to their children. There's obvious things that we can identify for which a father ought not to be related to his child. But much like there being higher goods at different levels, and then various goods at various levels, and the justification for those goods. We examine the Father, and we examine his speech. We examine the way in which he is. I suppose we can say that in a genetic sense in the case of an absentee father who may have passed something down, which then is filtered through the world, and there's a sort of epigenetic influence on it. But undeniably, the role of the father, even at that level, extends to the child. In the more heavenly domain, well, it's not really heavenly domain, it's all heavenly, but in the domain of mind, within the domain of conscious experience, the way in which the father chooses to use his words or his physical expression to dictate to the child how, much like a piece of clay that is to be molded or a mirror that one is to be seen in, the father projects and molds this clay into something that is to be. And his role in that is almost like an extension of something that is as fundamental as the self's heart and reason. It is almost like it exists in this third party. It is the other human beings, the other intelligible, or perhaps I should just say intelligent agents, free agents. There's a way in which the spirit is so firmly attached to certain people that the expression of the soul filters as much through the individual reason, the individual heart, or that seat of being, as it does through those who they love. Hearken unto your Father that begat you. And so, to listen in this sense would be as fundamental as listening to our own self, listening to our reason, listening to the way that we feel, listening to the way in which we experience the world. As we listen to this, also there is this third element. So again, it's to what I'm trying to outline here is the fundamental nature, the place that the Father occupies. And when I went into this bit before, it is sort of the reflection on how, much like one can have a poorly developed heart or a poorly developed rational mind, one can have a poorly developed relationship to, well, we can say, I don't think this is the fundamental level, but at that person that begat us. Perhaps I shouldn't say that because it depends on where we go. There is this fundamental layer of begetting, of bringing something to be. And then there are a bunch of strings off of this. It's a very complicated web in my mind, because there's a lot of context. There's a lot of things that are dependent on other things. But much like in the mind, in the brain, how different structures are dependent on very small underlying interactions of neurons, we still yet have this mind, and it develops as it does, under the laws and constraints that are placed on it. Similarly, our culture, our society, I think, develops in this way. It's an extension of us. And much like our culture and our society are an extension of us, those who have played fundamental roles in our experience are extended into us, through us, and we to them. We form this network, this sort of like the mushrooms, this interesting network. Despise not your mother when she is old. I find it interesting that there's a specific reference to when she is old, as if there is a increased probability that when the mother turns old, then a person, the offspring of that parent, would be more likely to despise her. And perhaps there's something about age that causes this to be. One has to wonder. I think of the potential that age brings, all the different ways in which we can age and become old. All of us will experience it. We will feel it in mind and in body. And perhaps there's something about this decay and approach towards the ending that causes us to have an error, a mind, a perception, a reaction of disgust, of horror, of sorrow, whether it be the mother that we love or the mother that we have had the unfortunate experience with. Regardless, towards the end, I think there's an aspect of our experience that is distasteful. It is ugly in a sense. All of us will experience this at some point, some sooner than others. This unfortunate observation of death and the process of dying, the process of old age. Now, the word despise is an interesting one. From the Latin, we have to look down or to look away from. And this is sort of why I bring this up. Because if we look down or look away from something, we can be ashamed, embarrassed. We don't want to interact with. There's something interesting about eye contact. The bond that it produces, the mutual attention that it affords, and this looking down in a way it prevents that bond from occurring. I suppose it doesn't need to be said that the bond between the mother and the child, regardless of age, ought to be a strong one. It is an important one, a fundamental one, regardless of the nature of the relationship, good or bad. I didn't do this with the father, but the big patterns here of male and female, I think, apply. We can make this verse into something other than it might potentially be. Sometimes it's hard to say, but there ought not to be an excuse not to explore. So for the mother of the feminine, what can be said? In a fundamental sense, the feminine is the receiver, the facilitator, the nourisher. She is the one that teaches, I think, most intimately, perhaps, the foundations of love. The father perhaps does this indirectly. Now I speak to a degree culturally here. both in the mother and the father definitely have fundamental roles at shaping how the child views love and interaction. But I suppose where I will come down on this verse is that just because we have matured and we have an adult mind and we look upon our mother as she is old and she meets age with its unfortunate ailments, that it is not for us to look down and away. We ought to maintain that bond until the end, however we can. By the truth, and sell it not, also wisdom and instruction and understanding. So buy the truth. This is not B-Y, this is B-U-Y, as in purchase. It's a fun opportunity to consider what it means to buy the truth. For the truth is not a material object, necessarily. The truth is dependent in some way. One must ask, well, what is the truth? What is it dependent upon? If there is no conscious mind to perceive of something as being true versus something that is false, what can we say of the truth? It would seem that some sort of agent is required, even in the absence of man, to have some structure that causes the truth to be. Just being in general is a form of truth. It is a form of existence. It is a form of, as I've said, being, or something that is. It would be a strange thing to say that the sun is false, or that the book in front of me is false. It's easier to, well, I suppose we could say that in a way that the book in front of me is false, perhaps by the content or the words that can be argued, but what I mean necessarily is the material structure, the object. That it is not false because, in my experience, I can do many things to prove and to justify its existence. But within my mind, I can imagine plenty of things for which I am not sure that they are true. I can think of problems. I can think of potential for which one thing may be true, another may be false. And so it would seem that this truth and falsehood exists in the mind. If we were to define what is true and what is false, I'll have to begin by asking Google to provide me a definition. So that which is true is something that is defined as in accordance with fact or reality, accurate or exact. Now, as I've mentioned, what makes this interesting, this true and falsehood, is man's participation in it. Because in this definition, the accordance with fact or reality, we have the word accord or accordance, which is a type of conformity or agreement. And it seems so strange to me to imagine in our experience, we have this ability to be in disagreement with reality, or to be out of line with. And it's so hard to imagine because it is caused by that which is. And how is it the case that from simple elements that produce complex things on top of their basic structure, things that are undeniably true, can come together to produce something that is false? This gets into questions about mind, of consciousness, of self. Certainly self-deception. But where I get hung up is where the basic elements, as they form and they come together to produce the self, or something that is, aware, conscious, an agent, independent of the otherwise or seemingly unconscious underlying elements. But perhaps that is where the mistake lies. It is within the understanding that we are entirely separate, or the form that characterizes us is in some way independent of the form of simpler elements that come to produce ours. Now, of course, there are some distinctions between a single neuron and the human being or the human brain. But at the fundamental layer, I have to wonder about awareness, about consciousness, about the level in which something that is interfaces with reality. For these simple things, as far as we are aware, do not have the type of conception that we do of true and false. So what does it mean, then, in their experience, in the absence of self-awareness and consciousness, self-deception? We could talk about survival. We could talk about optimization, this sort of mathematical exactness that seems to underlie simplicity. I think the problem here for me is that when thinking about things that are outside of the conception of the way man experiences reality, it is the absence of a self, of a willful direction, but perhaps that's not even it. It is the absence of orientation. Now, in the case of a cell, it has a nucleus, and that makes perfect sense. I can come up with some justification there. But for even simpler elements, just take the element in general. True and false seems, in this context, not to make much sense to me, because there is no orienting structure. And perhaps I could find myself into a way of saying that there is. Within each element there is a nucleus, with their protons and neutrons. And we can go down farther, and we can think about things of the way in which they are. suppose we can reflect on the way in which things are and the way in which things produce them to change the way in which they are. But just because they change, it doesn't mean that they are false. Just because we change doesn't mean that we are false. Agreement with reality. And this is a strange thing. If reality is all that there is, how is it that there would be anything else to agree with other than that thing? And this is the interesting part of mind, that it can produce these delusions. When I think of delusion, I think of another word, deception. And much like the word despise, there is a relationship in its Latin root. To take away, to take down, to seize away. And what is being taken away? What is being taken down? In the case of man, as if he makes some mistake, some falsehood, he is being taken away from something, that which is, that reality. He is moving towards nothingness. He's moving towards some ending. And perhaps, if all we can say of truth and falsehood is that it is a human conception based on the way we experience reality, fine. Whether or not it truly exists, difficult to say. But surely, that if reality is to have all of these wondrous possibilities, then even the possibility of falsehood is a type of truth. But it is a type of truth that's relative to some more foundational center point of intelligibility, such that the mind has the capacity to go away from it. And just because it goes away doesn't mean that, I suppose we would call it false, but it moves away into another area that is still true. It's just farther away from the relative set of facts that the organism needs to adhere to participate with reality, such that they can survive and to make sense of it. Now, the interesting thing about the word buy, I have a definition here: to obtain in exchange for payment, or in the informal sense, to accept the truth of. Another interesting relationship here, because we have the word accept, as we are these participants in accepting reality. That although we would want things to be otherwise, and are wanting that extension of our will, may be beyond the level or the layer or of the time constraints under which we operate. And because of this, that potential for delusion, for falsehood, or the moving away of the necessary constraints that dictate our experience is possible. And that to buy the truth means to accept it. If we think about it in an economic sense, I'm sure we can find some likely parallel. That if we are to exchange something for payment, or if we are to pay something for this truth. Money, in this context, I suppose, would work if we pay for education. What we are trying to do is use our storehouse of value, that temporary potential, unleash it into an environment that facilitates our growth, that facilitates our coming to, our moving towards, our acceptance of that which is, through instruction, surely. Buy the truth and sell it not. Now, to sell it is easy to understand, I think, at this point. For if we are to exchange it, we are to move away from it under the belief that it would help us in some way, that it would provide for us in some way, and yet what we are moving towards is the absence. We are moving towards a state for which things are not. And as a result, we are in error, we are in falsehood. Then the verse continues, and it says, also wisdom, instruction, understanding. So I think I explored the instruction aspect, but I also think the understanding and the wisdom is wound up in that idea or the illustration of buying truthfulness through education. As we are moving towards, and perhaps this is an idea that needs to be fleshed out even farther. This idea of moving towards reality. If we are to think about this, not just purely from a physical standpoint, but more from a spiritual standpoint, in which man's experience can be enlivened a little bit from his basic material constraints, and we imagine of the totality of experience of beings that are able to appreciate different dimensions of experience better than the human being can, more efficiently, whatever. We imagine the layer and the level by which they participate with reality, and we also can appreciate, we imagine, beings that are lower than us on that scale, that interpret reality in a less resolute manner, perhaps not from a sensing standpoint, but more from a cognitive standpoint. I think of a deer versus the experience of a man. The deer have quite astute senses, probably can hear much better than man, perhaps are much quicker than man, and yet their conscious experience and their awareness is quite basic relative to man. And so we have this range of experience that is possible. And at each level, apart from the level that which is, and that understands all of it, we have such a strange relationship, because we jut out off of this centerpiece of origin, seemingly into the nothingness, into the darkness, to light it up. But much of that darkness is because of the way in which we fall, the way in which we move away. Instruction is directional. Understanding is positional. Wisdom, relational, contextual. And I think all of these components, understanding where one is going, and, or knowing where one is going, knowing what supports them as they go, and knowing how to connect things together as they are on this experience, all of this together forms this image, this map, this web network of the reality that they are in. And there just seems to be like so much possibility there for what man can do or to get lost in. The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begetteth a wise child shall have joy of him. So that, I have a feeling that the verse prior, when we were talking about man's orientation to that center point, that divine logos, the peak of the mountain, that which is towards truth. In some sense, this righteousness, it is not necessarily, we can say of the divine logos that it is righteous, but of man as he can be righteous at his level. I think it is because of the wisdom, instruction, and understanding. It is the utilization of all of these things such that he has produced a map in his mind and was able to execute a plan of action such that he was able to build something, to produce something, practical perhaps, of a person that is righteous. A definition here is of a person or a conduct morally right or justifiable, virtuous, very good, excellent. We can say of righteous that it is a state or a condition of of knowing that which is true. And I think in order to know or to be in a state or a condition, to know something that is true, it is like seeing an image that is correct, or by having the key that unlocks the right door. And he that begetteth a wise child shall have joy of him. I see some thought that can go towards the conditional nature of begetting. That certainly there is a bit of a lottery that we play. That is much beyond us, not dependent upon us. The child can be born with any number of ailments or of personality traits that may make things easier or more difficult to be wise or to be considered wise. But just assuming that this child, for whatever reason, has developed the ability to connect things together, to maintain their connections, to understand them, and to appropriately participate in them. One has to wonder, where is the joy? Of course, a father has a bond, a very strong relationship to the child. And it's because of the nature of this bond, perhaps, that the wisdom is not just localized to the child, but rather within that bondedness and that connectedness of the father, the wisdom proliferates. It proliferates. It expands to those who are around the person who is wise. Your father and your mother shall be glad, and she that bore you shall rejoice. So here we have an interesting pattern. This verse is coming off of the last verse, that is, it's referencing the last verse. And because it is referencing the last verse, the pattern, I believe, is it's like an extra prompting. It's asking us to consider again. And the thing about these types of verses is that it is not necessarily the typical pattern that we see, that perhaps within the chapter you'll have a couple verses and then later on there's another verse that's kind of similar in nature, similar linguistically. Certainly between chapters we have the repetition of verses, maybe not necessarily in totality, but in general form. But we don't usually see it one right after the other. Now, I say that because the content of verse 25 is held in verse 24. Verse 25 is used to serve as like an exclamation or a direction pointing backwards. The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begets a wise child shall have joy of him. So we have begetting of a wise child, and we have a righteous child. Your father and your mother shall be glad, and she that bore you shall rejoice. And so in this verse, in verse 25, there's really nothing of the type or the quality that we have seen in verse 24. It says nothing about the reason that the father and mother would be glad. It says nothing about the reason for the rejoicing. Now, of course, within the bearing of a child, there ought to be some rejoicing. But it is not of the quality that we have come to expect from the Proverbs. And so we refer to the previous verse for righteousness and for wisdom. So again, we are prompted to consider righteousness and wisdom. So this is a very broad verse. We are meant to paint in very broad strokes. Some are not always this way. So there's a lot of freedom here. And so let's exercise it. Let's see what we can do with it. Now I'd like to start with the word rejoice, because it's a repeat pattern. We have joy and then we have rejoice. Both of which, I think rejoice contains this joy. I also think that both of these serve as an aspect of celebration. Celebration, a word that I have heard take quite a lofty place in terms of the linguistic hierarchy and the Christian worldview. To say another way, that is this aspect of celebration is venerated. It is something that is held quite highly. It is important. So, like always, or maybe not like always, but like usual, I'm going to start with talking about the etymology of this word, rejoice. So it seems like there is some origin in the Old French, and of course in the Latin. Now that prefix meaning again, back, and joyer, in the Old French, Joiir, or Joir, meaning to enjoy, or to be joyful. So that really doesn't help us all that much, the second half of that. So we go to the Latin, and we have a meaning that is, again, to rejoice, which doesn't help, or to be glad. This also doesn't help us all that much. I suppose it helps us to a degree. I think all of us have some understanding of what rejoice or joy or to be glad means. However, I was thinking about this today, about the fullness of experience. And there are many times, especially when I am in a mind, in a way, where I am not as connected as I ought to be. I'm not as attentive as I ought to be. My mind is focused on what is ahead rather than what is now. The feelings, the more cherished feelings, of which I would say joy, rejoicing are there. I feel like they fall by the wayside because of my poor sight, because I'm focused on something other than that which is current and present. That's not to say that the future has no... That is not to say that the future deserves no thought. I think it does. But if it occupies a large space in mind, I think it could serve as a place, as an altar, to sacrifice one's attention and take away from that which is the present, which of course is quite important. So at the very least here, we have this meaning of to be joyful again, or to return to some place. Now this is something that occurs over and over again. It's something that it's almost a perennial pattern, this prefix re, the return, the coming again. There are many words relatively recently that we have explored that go down this path. But the coming again, or the coming back to, or coming to, is always interesting to me, because we have exposed within this landscape some purpose, some direction for which we are going. Even if we don't exactly know where we are, we know where we ought to be. Or we know that there is at least a place that is for us, that is for the mind to settle. So now it is a matter of determining what joy is. For we have the understanding that it is possible to come back to this state of joy if we have left it. So of joy, we have the symbol that is evoked here. The most prominently is the heart, the factory of our feelings and desires, the seat of our feelings. Of joy, we understand it occupies a fundamental space. It is a deep and intense emotion. The feeling that we have is a feeling of happiness, contentment, well-being. It's positive. It brings us a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. It can cause us to laugh, to smile, to express gratitude. Now I'll pause for a moment and say, what a beautiful thing to come back to. If one has gone out on a long day, I think of a sort of in a symbolic sense, the hike of life, in which during our productive hours we are engaged in this survival type scenario in which we are bound to labor for something. We are bound to produce value. Now, ideally, our efforts should be in line with what we desire and love. And ideally, what we devote our labors to is something that we can tolerate. But there are many situations, many cases, I think, that man finds himself in a situation in which he labors because he must labor. It is not that he labors because he enjoys his labor. And now I don't really have anything one way or another to say about that. I think it's just a condition of life. Now, having said that, assuming that most of us are in a situation for which labor is something that is understood that must be done in order to achieve basic necessities for survival, I think it also means that when we move into this realm of mind, this mode of participation, that it is not always the case that we feel this satisfaction and contentment, but rather that we are devoted, or we are participating in something that is a responsibility, it is an obligation. And I make no moral judgment here, I'm just saying that this is a fact for many of us. Now, being that as it is, I think this aspect of joy, something that we return to, the feeling of satisfaction and contentment that we may experience through our labors, but the type of joy and satisfaction that we desire above anything else. And now that could be somebody's occupation, perhaps, but I think for many it is their close associations, their loves, their type of interaction that they experience outside of that occupational preoccupation. I think here it is also important to say that joy can find itself present in many aspects of man's experience. Again, I mentioned that it's possible that it could be found in labor. I made the suggestion that labor is a means to an end, and perhaps it doesn't necessarily involve joy. These are sort of secondary points, but let's just say that joy can be found here. It could be found in the bosom of family. It could be found within one's solitude. It can be found in many places. But we have to remember what we are talking about here, contextually. We're talking about the relationship that a father and a mother have to their child, but it's a particular type of child. It's a child that expresses certain qualities, the righteous qualities and the wise qualities. And these are both conduits towards that which leads to contentment, that which leads to happiness, that which leads to satisfaction, fulfillment, the expression of these feelings of joy, the laughter, the smiles, the feeling of connectedness. And so now it's a matter of really reflecting on righteousness and wisdom. For these are the places for which we understand how to follow the map. These are more guides to the experience rather than the experience itself, it would seem to me. For somebody, in the case of rejoice, one must be brought into it. drawn into it. And what it is a series of affordances, I believe, between various individuals. Now, even if it is just one individual, I think that there is still a series of affordances, that individual is necessarily returning to a state that they desire, that causes them to be content and happy. And with anything, there is the opposite side of the coin. There is that type of joy, contentment, fulfillment that is based in experiences that are less than ideal, based in experiences that are corrupt, we can say. And how to navigate this, I think, is kind of interesting. I don't want to get too lost in the possibilities here. But all the same, I think, as a useful placeholder, I think it's easy for me to understand that the coming to, or moving from one state of experience, of being, to another, which involves the outflow, the outpouring of the heart's products, all of the feelings and desires, and our reason. The transition between this and another requires some sort of attractor, whether it be a memory, a person, a quality, an event. Or some willful expression of a desire that makes one move towards the fulfillment of that desire. And here there's an almost endless possibilities for which one can find themselves satisfied, both of the good kind and of the bad kind. But again, to return to what I was saying earlier, we are moving in a particular direction. Despite how broad this verse is, and how broad our brush is now, we are given righteousness and wisdom to guide our way. Now, this is not a definition of righteousness, not a definition of wisdom, or I should say we are not provided a definition of these terms, but rather we are prompted to consider that of the relationship that a mother and a father has with a child, if that child is to be of the righteous and wise sort, then there will be this state of joy. And it is not just any old state of joy. It is not the state of joy that one can find in and through the confines of perversion and of a darkened mind, for example. It is through the lighter sort, the better sort of experience, the higher sort of experience, that we find a different type of satisfaction and joy. So again, to return to the idea, righteousness and wisdom are the facilitators, they are the guide to the experience. They pull us in to rejoice, to return to that experience of fulfillment, satisfaction, laughter, smile. Now for myself, I think the best way to think about how this is possible is to think how far away I can find myself during the day, during the working week, for example, when I'm doing my regular work. There are periods that I feel so far away from joy that I feel maybe fatigued, I feel absent, I feel inattentive, I feel robotic. I'm sure we all have this type of experience for which it seems that life, although we don't get too upset about it because we understand that life is more than just that experience, but it is almost a melancholic, depressing sort of experience to go through when it happens. Sometimes it's brief, sometimes it lasts for a few hours, sometimes for a few days, a few weeks. And there are all sorts of different types of this sort of thing, but when the wave comes over me, let's say in the middle of the day, when I feel this urge, from where and for what reason, it's hard to say, this urge of despair because I feel as though my participation in this experience is strained. It is overworked, it is overburdened. In those moments, I find it very difficult to return to a place that I know exists. I don't even know where to start on that journey to move out of the state of fatigue, out of the state of not wanting or inattentiveness, that robotic nature, towards something that is truly meaningful and worthwhile. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, much like it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to get the body warmed up for a rigorous physical exercise. But the question is, whether it be in preparation for intense physical exercise, or whether it be in preparation for a type of experience with another person, a type of interaction with another person, in a way that it is not robotic, is not superficial. Because I've seen the situation in which the robotic can resemble joyful expression, but it is very likely that the actual expression is not really joy. It is more of a momentous performance than anything else. And I think that there may be even some deception in that. I myself have been a participant, and I know what it feels like. It doesn't feel good. But it happens almost because it feels like it is necessary, because otherwise that expression that is either desired or imagined to be important for the context is so highly valued by the self that it is actually preferred over the genuine experience and the work that is required for that genuine experience. So now, regardless of the condition or the state that we find ourselves in, and regardless of the level of deception that we find ourselves in, which is a big problem if we are wanting to go somewhere, if we feel ourselves to be, or if we believe, or if we don't even understand that we are deceived, how can we even begin to move up and out of it? A difficult one, but there's a strange feeling, certainly. If one is to reflect on a feeling of apprehension, then perhaps there is something truthful about that apprehension, and that there's something about the way in which we are attempting to get ourselves to the rejoice that is just not right, it is unjust. Or rather, it just cannot be justified in the way that we are approaching it. So, going back to myself in this experience, within the robotic nature, part of this, I think, is there's a necessary sacrifice, there's a necessary burden that must be had. And it's not as though we get from point A to point B immediately. It's something that we build. Ideally, if we are in good shape, if we are righteous or wise, I think the qualities that we do possess are those that allow us to get from point A to point B. But it's not just any old point A and not just any old point B. It is from a place lesser to a place higher. And it's kind of hard to deceive oneself if one is to look at this in a vertical rather than just in a arbitrary horizontal. because here in the vertical we are describing something that is based on true value. So now the question is, of every single one of us that holds this capacity for experience, we also hold, I think, the capacity for righteousness and for wisdom. And so if we call upon that aspect of ourselves to rise up in those moments when we are faithful, in the sense that we are committed to the willful drawing up from that well, the finer spirits of our soul or of our experience, what is the mechanism by which we drag ourselves out of the pit, out of that stagnant pool? Well, I think, in my mind, the first step is to go outside of oneself. Perhaps it's to ask a question. But to go outside of oneself, it's a good first step. But to ask a question is a hard one. And so in the context of the laboring environment, it depends on what occupation one serves in. It could be quite a solitary thing. And that situation is different. But in my case, it is quite an interactive, interpersonal one. It requires a lot of communication, often quite detailed communication. Communication with many people, many different people. So I must apologize. Today is a new day. And I finished that previous thought in the middle, so it's going to be kind of difficult to pick up where I left off. Now, as I re-listened to that audio recording, I felt a little bit dissatisfied with the approach that I was taking. Now, I plan on finishing it because I think I understand where I was going with it. So to recap, what I'm trying to get to here has to do with the root or the etymological origin of this word rejoice, that there is this implication at the foundation that we are returning to something, and that something we have established is a state of being, it's a state of mind. I've talked about the possibilities for which man can label this, that, and the other thing joy, but it may or may not be true joy, which is kind of an arbitrary thing to say, especially since we're trying to figure out what it is. But at the very least, we can identify types or aspects of behavior and experience that are probably a bit, at least to the majority, outside of what we would consider to be a joyous experience, and maybe otherwise a selfish, delusional experience. So all of that aside, I mentioned this place of work, and I mentioned that there are times that I feel unable to appropriately participate or answer the call for which I am obligated to answer. And what I wanted to do, and perhaps what I will try to still do, is to determine exactly how I, as a faithful person, can come to a type of understanding, a type of security of being, that I can enter into a state of mind in a disciplined manner, such that I would be safe from the unfortunate aspects, the pitfalls of perhaps just general everyday life. I think that there are realities to life that we just can't avoid. There are going to be periods of fatigue. There are going to be periods of inattentiveness or dissatisfaction. But it is the way in which we deal with these things that I think is important. It is how we call ourselves back to the state of rejoice that is important. And so I mentioned starting by asking a question. And the formulation of this question is the difficult part. The commitment, the faithful part, I think, is an easy thing, conceptually. At least for me, it makes sense that one ought to commit their mind to doing one thing. It is the execution, or the doing part, that is difficult. Now, when I say all of this, I come to this with the understanding that there's a certain aspect of life and of participation that doesn't require this type of thought. We just sort of enter into it. Again, I want to reiterate that this is for a particular place, a particular feeling, it's a particular disposition. It's a way to get out of a funk if we find ourselves in one. And I have to say, as I reflect on my day today, much of it I was able to enter into that flow state. Some of it I was feeling a bit of that dread, maybe like a subtle melancholy beneath. There are other days, I've already said this, but it can get quite difficult. And so having a good, practical way to navigate these moments, I think, is important, and it gets to the heart of what is being said here. Your father and your mother shall be glad, and she that bore you shall rejoice. It is the return home through wisdom. It is the return home through righteousness. And so to return to this question, it must be an extension of something. Well, what are we putting forward? What are we offering within our question? If our language is to be a vehicle of meaning, then what ought we to put forth? I think there has to be an element of connectedness. The question has to open up, or at least facilitate, the possibility of developing a connection at a certain level. That certain level is the level that's required to enter into joy, the joyous experience. There has to be some reasonable and honest concern for the individual, and I think that should be highlighted within the conversation or the question. This concern, this question, this general question, and the extended process by which we enter into this dialogue with other people or experience, it doesn't just have to be a dialogue. In the sense of righteousness, we are prompted to be just actors. We are prompted to consider our reason, to justify our reason towards the ends that we pursue. And that justification has to be towards the good, towards that highest peak. And I think it's often vague and difficult to ascertain exactly what that peak is. And this is sort of why I think that the means are almost as important as the ends, because we can have an end, but if our means are not taking us towards some good end, then we are going to lack the type of outcome that all of us may or should desire. Now, I understand that this language is vague, but the sentiment that I wish to convey is that within the righteous person, within the wise person, since we are considering the wise son, the facilitatory aspect the child provides is to keep the parents grounded, to keep the parents oriented towards that which is good and proper, keeps their habits appropriate and non-destructive. It keeps their home life pleasant and flourishing. It keeps their relationships strong and stable, though not without conflict and challenge. This is a given part of life. But within the righteous, we have a strong judge, somebody that can provide strong reason or justification for their behaviors and their actions. Within the wise, we have somebody that can integrate experiences well and facilitate meaningful experiences within themselves and between other people. And in this way, we have a strong means towards the end, which is moving us closer towards that centerpiece, that divine logos, the type of satisfaction in life that is not plagued by deception or by the sinful nature. My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways. Now, similar to the last couple verses, this is another one of these that we are given a broad brush to paint with. And sometimes these verses can yield quite fantastic results. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get exactly much of anywhere. But much like in my own experience with exercising or just general life, if we don't participate, if we don't try, then certainly we won't get to a good outcome. So, despite the big picture and the potential melancholy that the grandness of our pursuits may invoke, let's begin by moving this into down some productive, prosperous path. My son, give me your heart. So this is the divine logos that is speaking. Now, anytime the divine logos speaks, we have to be very diligent. We have to be, I think, a little critical to imagine how it is possible that something can be false. The critical nature is not at the center place of our pursuit, of course. But given that we are dealing with the principle of the logos, we are considering order, we are considering knowledge, we are considering perennial principles, governing principles. And almost by definition, foundational principles are meant to be load-bearing. They are meant to be constant. They are meant to be something that we can depend on and rely upon. They are also things, ideas, conceptions, structures that ought to hold up to rigorous testing. So, what does it mean to give our heart to God? The heart is, as I've been describing it, the seat of our desires and our feelings. It is something that is open to deception, but it is something that is also fundamental to our experience. The other half, I would say, is our own logos, our own reason, our own ability to come to some understanding of that which is true. The marriage between the reason and our heart, I think, is the union that leads to the identifiable self. It is something that is separated from one person to the next. Of course, there's that physical separation, but within mind we have these aspects that determine our being. this heart is also somewhat of a primeval, primitive organ, not in totality, for just like anything else, primitive man can be civilized, he can be intellectualized, he can be made practical, reasonable. And that extends, as I've said, both to his reason but also the efficiency of his feelings and the appropriateness of his feelings. When I say primeval or primitive, what I mean is there's an aspect of the heart's agency that is very reactionary, and for good reason. It may warn us of danger. This is something that may prompt us into reason rather than reason prompt us into feeling. And in that sense, it has its own degree of action, its own degree of will or agency. And it is from this conception that I believe that the will of man precedes both his heart and his reason. It is something that the soul affords him. It is something that his existence affords him. Now, there's a matter of precision here. I suppose that this can be thought of in a number of ways, but when we say the soul of man as opposed to the soul of some animal or the existence of a rock, which we might call the soul of a rock, it's kind of strange to put it in that way. But what I mean to say is that we have the capacity to intuit and to examine the world at a particular level. And as such, the beings that are self-aware, conscious, experiential, this is the soul. It is the seat of being. And in the context of man, he is given this capacity. And based on that capacity, it is modified through the filters of the heart and through his reason. And since he has this will, both of heart and of reason, to direct his sight in the heavenly sense, really anywhere he pleases, not without possible consequences or benefits, he is able to do so. And as he does, at the particular way and level in which he does, his attention affords him a certain view of reality, of life. His attention affords him certain luxuries or burdens. And I think because of this relatedness between his attention and his fundamental aspects, the heart, the reason, his soul, that we could then easily understand that where his attention goes is really where the value is placed. Now, man is much like a central bank. He can print money as he sees fit, but it is not without consequence. Money being this transmission of value, a medium of exchange. His attention, similarly, afforded by at the fundamental level, that which is intelligible, that which is directed and orderly, purposeful. If we imagine in a like manner that parallel between the economic example and that of man's capacity to generate value and meaning, I think we can appreciate that there's an entire world by which we can conceptualize his attentive capacities, attentive expenditures, and we can examine the relationship of where, just like we can examine the relationship of where money goes, how this affects broader societal, multiplicitous, communal purchasing habits, how there's cause and effect relationships between, say for example, interest rates and the buying capacity or the willingness of people to go out and spend their money on goods and services. In this way, this is sort of an extension of this more fundamental level, I think. But in this way, as a thought experiment or an intellectual pursuit, I think we can imagine, I'm not sure by what metric we would measure it. It's an interesting thought, but just from the general sense, we can imagine this picture, this grand world that exists both within our minds, but also it can be extended by our awareness of how attention moves through societies and through an individual's mind to formulate and impact his behaviors. So surprise, surprise, there's another break in the continuity of that prior recording. I had recorded that little bit before I went to work this morning, and now I've gone through the day, I've had various experiences, and now I'm back here in my chair, in front of my Bible, in front of my microphone, and my computer. And here we go again. So, I don't believe I got all that far, other than laying down some ground information, which I won't go over again. My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways. So I finished illustrating this world in which we can examine man's attentive capacities, the exchange of his value, his attention, again, much like that central bank, just that creator of value. Much like central banks, I think they have the risk, or they take on the risk. Perhaps they take on the hubris. The belief that they are able to create value from nothing. And it is not our place, I think, to take from nothing, because there is nothing to take from nothing. We are related beings. We exist within networks of relatedness, both between other people and also just generally the environment, that we as beings depend so much, despite our relatively recent cultural, societal wealth in the material sense. We depend quite a bit on the environment, down to the very air that we breathe. And so nothing is quite free, but at the same time, it is not the case that man is completely absent of value. It is that he, or rather I should say, that's a strange way to put it, it's because he exists within this network, because there is so much interdependence between man, or this conscious being that is self-aware, that seemingly experiences reality in such a bizarre way compared to other forms of life that we see. And further, because I think culturally we make such a big deal about the freedom of will, and I don't think I have taken the appropriate time to really be honest about what I mean when I go about believing in something such as free will. There are obvious constraints to my action, whether it be physical or cognitive. I will bump up against some boundary. I am not liberated from everything. I'm not liberated from my lungs. I'm not liberated from the environment. I'm not liberated from paying taxes. I'm not liberated from labor. I'm not liberated from pain. I'm not liberated from joy, nor love. There are things that attach to us that can certainly be variable, no doubt, but there are things that attach to us that are fundamental, that we cannot change, that our freedom of will perhaps can go so far as to delude ourselves into thinking that there is such a thing as absence. But absence only for the self, it would seem. And now going back to what I was getting at when I decided to amend what I was saying, that the human beings that have little value or no value, what I was attempting to say was that although we have the limitations on our freedoms, our freedom to do, it doesn't mean that man is completely bound by everything. There's an acceptable window for which he can act at the level at which he experiences the world and reality. And because he possesses this, I think he finds himself in an interesting position, because he can do quite a lot despite his restraints. For the restraints are the very thing that allows him to exist at all. And so keeping in mind that we are talking about giving our heart to something, we are giving an aspect of ourselves that is fundamental to the essence of our experience to something. And we can only do that through will. And I hope that statement conveys the gravity of meaning that I would like to convey, that I would think it conveys. How significant a thing it is to commit. And I don't just mean superficially commit, but I mean to commit the heart to something. Now I suppose at this point there is an issue that we have to talk about. And this issue has to do with the word give. For there are two things here. There's the aspect in which giving the heart, or surrendering it in the sense that is outside of the ownership of the self, is false. It's almost like the physical, material example. Now, it's not quite physical or material, it has physical, material underpinnings. But even to give, I may be wrong, but I'm going to explore it here. But even to give, in a certain sense, there's another sense in which I don't think this is the case, which I'll go into. But to give the heart, again, one of the fundamental essences of our experience, if we gave it completely, it would be almost as if we are giving a part of our physical heart. Now, if we gave part of our physical heart, the heart would not be able to function adequately as an organ. It wouldn't be able to circulate the blood through our body. Our various organs would not be able to receive the nutrients that it needs to sustain and to survive, and we would die. In a like manner, although the physical nature may not die if the heart doesn't exist, there are plenty of situations in which man may find himself in an unfortunate position, whether it be through some genetic defect or because of a traumatic brain injury, where he is not able to experience reality as the standard human being does. I think in this way, if we were to truly give the heart away, we would find ourselves in this sort of, not necessarily animalistic, but a retarded sense of mind, a suppressed sense of mind. An aspect of our experience would be completely gone. We would be completely robotic. But it would be more than just that. It would be, the heart is something that has within it, bound up within it, the sensory information of the environment. It includes memories. It includes current information. Like, for example, right now this room is extremely hot and humid because the air conditioning is not on. I can feel, as I rub my hand over my leg, that there is sweat coming off of my leg. Now, thankfully it's not dripping, but it is quite hot and sticky in this room. The sensations that I am experiencing are influencing feelings that are being produced by my heart, or again, the aspect of mind. And it is because it is outside of my reason. I'm not trying to do this. I'm sort of almost, my heart is sort of independently causing me to feel a bit disturbed by how warm it is in this room. And so instead of suggesting, as I was about to a moment ago, that if we got rid of the heart, then we would all sort of be sociopathic, psychopathic individuals, purely mathematical, reasonable, step-by-step, logical. I don't think that that's the case. I think we would be missing a fundamental element of one of the major links that actually fits into our logical selves. It is information. It is a key component of information integration. So now to completely give this the way that we would give a present, that we would never see it again, or that we would never possess it again, I don't think it's quite precise enough to describe the type of relationship that we're having here. Now, I don't mean to say necessarily that the verse is wrong, but I think it is meant to be interpreted a bit differently. By give, I think what is meant, much like I've hinted to before, it is more so the facilitation of a certain type of relationship, as the wise or righteous child has with their parents. It's not as though the parents are taking from the child's wisdom or righteousness. They're experiencing it with the child. They're moving towards something. They're going home. They're finding that the note in which the piece of music, the key in which the music is played, to end on, to come home, to resolve, to be satisfied, to be fulfilled, to feel joy. And much like we depend on oxygen and the environment to survive, we depend on that base level, intelligible origin of all experience to maintain that aspect of mind. And so it's not necessarily that we are giving something up or away completely. We are giving something in the sense that we are sharing possession. We are allowing influence. We are allowing, just as I had mentioned a moment ago about the sensory information, we are letting the self, parts of the self go that would otherwise hold us back, that would otherwise tell us that our will is so supreme that we should deny external input. If we deny that external input, we cannot effectively make decisions. My son, give me your heart. Now the beautiful follow-up to this, coming off of the heels of that interpretation, and let your eyes observe my ways. Again, we have this image of the sense organ that is taking in information. We've been asked to give an essence of our experience towards something, or give in my mind is a bit polluted, but what I mean is to invite and to connect ourselves, to open ourselves to that fundamental aspect of existence or essence, whatever, that fundamental layer of intelligibility, the appreciation that just as much as the physical body depends on oxygen to survive, the mind in its form, in its sort of self-aware sense, depends on essence or intelligibility to operate upon. It is that fundamental conscious landscape. Let your eyes observe my ways, much like we use our eyes in scientific pursuits to determine the chemical and physical structure of our reality. We do so not so independently of this process, I should say, but in conjunction and in unison. We do so to examine the cognitive, the intellectual, maybe intellectual is not the right word, I keep using this word intelligible. I could say understandable, I could say accessible, I could say comprehensible, but even these words aren't necessarily that bedrock. It's getting quite close, though. Perhaps I could say it is not the information that we see, or the information that presents itself in certain ways, but the information itself. So, I'm debating here, because I think that there is something interesting that lies within this, or maybe I should say that lies within the conversation of the eyes observing the way of the divine logos. Again, the bedrock, the purpose of information, not just the information, the purpose of information, the intelligibility, the comprehensibility, the accessibility, the reason that the information is there in the first place. Of course, what is being suggested here is that there is a reason for the information existing. And because there is a reason for the information to exist, we ought to behave as though there is a reason for that information to exist. Let your eyes observe my ways. Now, it's quite easy, I think, to think of the expression my ways as a human being experiences his way or his goings. And although it could be said that we are made in the image of God, that we have aspects of ourselves in the way that we are that might be similar, but much like the aspect of will, that we consider ourselves to be free, and yet we are constrained fundamentally. I think the illustration of the image of God, that we are in the image of God, can only go so far, necessarily. And the aspect that, or the way in which we look like, or experience the world, perhaps in the way that the divine logos, the purposeful force, the creationary element that has driven that reason for the way in which things connect to other things or relate themselves to other things. There is a way in which that creationary element experiences existence fundamentally different than the human being, because it could also be said in comparing a tree and man, there is certainly relatability in terms of the way in which that type of life is characterized but we are fundamentally different creatures. In the way that we are in the image of each other, we have cells that have some genetic makeup or have DNA that expresses our form or the way in which we come to interface with the world. Much can be said of the conscious sphere, the awareness of that which is, and then the conception of the deity of that is the mover of that which is. That's a fundamentally different experience. And because of that, we can find ourselves in relationship to it. But it's a matter of finding how we are related to that thing. It's easy to ignore a tree as we walk by it, but at some level I think we all understand how fundamental a tree is, given the production of oxygen as one of the fundamental elements of maintaining our existence, but also our aesthetic experience as we go through life. A life without vegetation is lessened, but just less valuable, I think. So I'd like to keep this in the background. I'm going to leave that there, and no doubt we will come back to this. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. What a strange verse to follow up from that last one. Now, another thing that I find interesting about this verse is the way it begins, almost as if it is coming off of the heels of the last verse, which it probably is. My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. Now, I think we can easily look quite a ways down into this verse and perhaps find something that is true, or perhaps find something that is more than is implied. Either way, we have established a relatively complex relationship between the heart and the divinity in the previous verse. Now, what is being suggested here is that there is some mechanism by which a man can fall away. That this is sort of the opposite of rejoicing. Instead of coming back to or re-entering the state of satisfaction, joy, whatever, it is the removal of these things into a sort of absence. Not entire absence, of course, but basic. For a whore is a deep ditch. So of a whore, we can say that it refers to a woman that sells herself for money, for whatever, goods and services. There is the path to go down here of discussing the nature of that profession, that decision to live life in that manner. And then there's the path in which we discuss how the whore opens, or is equivalent to a deep ditch, and perhaps we can do both. So of this whore, I would imagine that we would have to reflect on the nature of that being, the individual that chooses to walk that path. I'm wondering at the true sacrifice that must be made in order to walk that life. To say to oneself that value, that their contribution to the world is within the physical pleasure of those that they do not know, that are foreign to them. It is the establishment of a relationship that is, or that can be, used to facilitate something great. In the case of having children, the rearing of those children, to bring them up to embark on that journey and that experience. But even though that is a fundamental thing, surely an important thing, fundamental thing in the sense of our race, it is dependent upon strong parenting, strong rearing of children to have a successful society. So this is nothing to be downplayed. But there's something else that my heart is prompting me to consider. And it is more so, it's hard to say exactly, perhaps the state of mind, the state of being that the individual occupies. Because from the individual standpoint, from the standpoint of the whore, I think it is very likely, not in every situation of course, but it is possible that this person will not recognize what they do is wrong. And I think that's an interesting statement in and of itself. How can we even determine if prostitution is wrong, for example? We can examine the consequences that it has on society. But how can we say, and what could we say, of the way in which the person experiences existence given that path and that walk of life? And I think in order to do that, I have to put myself in those shoes. It's the only way that I can think through this. That if right now, if I was to put everything in my life down and to place on different shoes in the morning when my alarm goes off, embark on a different vocation, I think for my efforts, I may find myself into some consistent pattern of work such that money would be coming in and I would be provided for in that sense. But as I experience now, with an occupation that is demanding, any occupation is demanding, but I work a sufficient amount, enough to reflect on the way, the manner in which I spend my time, not only free time, but also my occupational time. And throughout that experience, it is an experience of trying to make it more efficient, more practical, more enjoyable to a degree. But by making it more enjoyable, I think the prerequisite is being more proficient, self-reliant, competent, capable. And these qualities, these attributes, would extend to any occupation, including this sort that we're talking about in this verse. I would quickly like to say that today is a new day, and I think that the manner of my speech may be a bit different from the day prior, so I figured I'd mention it. But to return to the thought, I suppose it can't be said that this discipline of prostitution, for surely I think we can say that one could be disciplined in just about anything, as I've mentioned just before. All sorts of skills and virtues can be developed out of anything that holds the ability to captivate one's attention. Prostitution is no different. So it is really not a matter of this level of being, of participating in, or perhaps I should say, not in this way. And I feel like there are a few different roads that we can go down here. But I have to see the image that is slowly presenting itself to me. That within work of its various sorts, we may find ourselves devoted. We may find a path to continue our experience, as I mentioned before, the procurement of food and shelter. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the occupation and the attention that we direct is on a good path. And this is the strange thing about this image, that it seems that the human being is able to take a path that exists like a fork in the road that he ought not to take. We had to wonder why such a thing exists. But I suppose we would only have to wonder why if we really felt that there was so much goodness that even the possibility of falsehood or of mistake to such a degree that the mind could be thrown out of a good experience, or perhaps not good experience, because I would imagine that there's plenty of good on the bad road. This is a matter of faith, I think. And I think it's a decision that, or it's a reflection that ought to be a bit discerning, a bit careful, a bit precise. Because on the bad road, and in the distinction of my mind that it is not everything that is to be good in reality, what should be known is that there seem to me, wherever there is darkness, there seems to be light that chases it away. And that it is within the unseen that man makes his mistakes, but not necessarily that the unseen itself is the thing that mistakes him. I think it is more his eyesight. That which is perceptible, perceivable, is there for us to see. And so this goodness that permeates all, one must wonder of the various layers at which it intersects itself with our experience, but also what we have come to consider that which is evil or that which is bad, and how this comes to also interface and intersect with man. For is man the creator of this sort of thing? Or is this sort of thing truly that, well, I suppose we would have to at least examine the possibility of the possibilities of experience that are outside the transcendent, that occupy lower levels of understanding, of reason, of sight. And at each one of these levels, outside of that grand totalizing intelligibility, a being that understands all of it, there is this possibility, that which is away from, that which is something that we are called to, because we have somehow been separated from it. And it's hard to justify. It's hard to justify our existence being separated from something. That we have been cut from something that we ought not to be far from. It seems as though, in a certain light, we've been abandoned by a father. In another light, I suppose, it's like being kicked out of the nest when one is young and perhaps doesn't understand the reality that they find themselves in. It's more likely to be the case. Surely it would be hubris to think that because we exist, we are necessarily these beings to be looked down upon, because we are separated from that thing that allows us to exist, the ground that allows our and supports our feet, the environment that supports our existence, the very reality that necessitates it, or that, again, allows it. So here we are. I suppose I've taken us down the bad path, or we are being led there. As a reminder, for a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. For a whore is a deep ditch. Now, as I've said, we found ourselves in this strange environment. In my mind, I'm picturing a part of the woods. Part of the woods that has a trail carved into it. There's nothing really around. It's dark outside, but the moon is full. There's plenty of light. That good within the bad. But it is dark, and I'm not sure where I'm going, despite the trail, or the illusion of a trail. What happens in this landscape if I find a deep ditch? I have been in environments and woods before where there can be quite steep drop-offs, and if one is not careful to fall down, it would be catastrophic, injurious. To find one's way out of it, difficult. A deep ditch. We already described that this place that we find ourselves is dark, dimly lit, the path uncertain. To fall down the ditch, I think, is to increase or to turn the knob up on the intensity of that general atmosphere. And now perhaps we are in a place where the moon's light doesn't reach us as it did when we were out of it. The shadows that are cast are much larger and much darker. So in the context of mind, we have found ourselves distracted. We were on a bad road to begin with, but now we are in a territory that is almost irreconcilable, irredeemable. What does the prospect of rejoicing look like now? For if we return to something, we return to that darkened road. What would our efforts even get us? What can we remember of the sun and of the prairie and of the open space, or of the certainty of the path that is before us, or of the connectedness that we feel to those that we love? It would seem that the farther down this ditch we go, the darker it gets. The layers of mind that are folded over, such that it becomes difficult for the self to justify its experience and its existence, increase. Now, this is a place that I think we have to bring in the whore. because she is the deep ditch. Her participation with the world, her belief in what she is doing, perhaps it could be said it is causing a ditch for her. That's something separate to explore. But for us, we have found ourselves in a place for which our minds have been so corrupted that the good to us seems not good enough because of how far we have fallen down that ditch. And it's either we desire that little bit of light that we can see in that darkness, like a cheap, quick, superficial orgasm, or we remember, we come back to something, a thought, a memory of mind, in which we understand that there is something more than that which we have been participating in. Now this is strange territory, but it is meant to facilitate what it means that we are participating in. It is meant to facilitate what it means that we are participating in. That in the situation, the extreme situation that we have been seduced, even though we have been so damaged by the fall that we have taken, and we find ourselves now within that deep ditch, and although that we see our surroundings are illuminated, there is a pull, it would seem almost as strong as gravity, that would seem to suggest that we are not where we ought to be. But let gravity, this spiritual gravity aside, perhaps it's not convincing enough that it would be the thing that is responsible for calling us out of it. But I would say even within the geography, there remains to be light, for our minds themselves are a beacon, not only hers, but also our own. And despite the light of that beacon, not in totality because at its fundamental level, the base experience for which it has value, true value, although it be perverted at some level, to occupy a layer and level of experience that is almost contrary. The light shines brighter in a darkened area. It is almost contrary, but it is a light that shines in absence of proper association. And in fact, I think much of this depends upon the way in which the two parties in question, the whore or the deep ditch itself, and the person that is interacting with this person or the ditch, it has to do with the perception and the mind of that person. For I can imagine all sorts of different scenarios. Again, it is the beacon. The beacon is capable of much. The beacon must also interface with the world. And the world has certain rules, laws, a reality to it, much of which again is beyond our conception or perception. And it is because of this we can develop a mistaken narrative, or a mistaken image, a mistaken idea of where we are. This applies to the physical realm as it does the conscious, or the imaginal. And I say this even without needing to do some precise calculation or measurement. It is quite easy to identify possibility. It's quite a bit more difficult to identify truth and associate that with the possibility or probability. But it is possible. We exist in the world. We are able to manage truth, to maintain ourselves, to maintain relationships with others, to love them, to propagate our species into the future. In this propagation of species, I think that agent acts at a level that is beyond man, but is almost uniquely man. A strange aspect of his expression within the collective. But I say all of this to say that the deep ditch, although it may be deep and may be an arduous climb for those who found themselves within one, if one is to be at the bottom of it and to find that reality of the situation that they find themselves in, now this is a tough one, because the mind is a powerful engine. Because it could find itself in the situation where it must necessarily climb out of it step by step. But I also think it is possible to show the individual the surrounding environment. If the individual appropriately sees that surrounding environment, he will no longer be in the ditch. He will no longer be on the bad path, but he will see his place and understand where he is relative to goodness. And it may not necessarily be his straying from that goodness, but rather his blindness from it that causes him to be in despair, that causes him to be blind. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. All right, so I should say that today is a new day. I'm glad I have a sufficient amount of time to devote to this. We'll see how far I get. Usually I record for about an hour, but I'd like to go for a little bit longer today. Today is a good day. It's a day off. It's a weekend. And before I got into the second half of this verse, I wanted to say how much I enjoy doing this. Sitting down and talking about the Proverbs. Talking about anything that's meaningful, as a matter of fact. And there's a bit of a lament. Of course, there always is with me. And that has to do with the people in my life not necessarily being as interested, exploring the depths as one might see it in the biblical sense, or in whatever sense, whether it be Plato or whatever. Now, I don't mean to be negative or to dwell there, but rather to reiterate that I enjoy this time, and if there is anybody's ear that this finds, please know that the voice that you are hearing is from as far down to the center of me that I can manage. It's intimate. It longs for a connection or for an ear. A strange woman is a narrow pit. An interesting expression. Of course, the last part of it was an interesting expression too, but I think we can go either two ways here. We can go the simple path and just say that this is some reiteration and therefore a prompting to consider, like we just had done. Or there is, because of this symbolic structure, some slight difference in meaning. Now, a thought that just sort of popped into my mind is that I heard in a podcast, I don't remember which one, that many of the Proverbs were written in the era of King Solomon, or perhaps written many by King Solomon himself, and the Psalms many written by King David. And one has to wonder about this information, about one man's life. Of course, in the Old Testament, we come to understand that Solomon is not a perfect person, but he is a wise person. And if it means anything, I suppose I should say that even though we are talking about the whore, even though we might be currently involved geopolitically in many different conflicts, Israel and Palestine and Russia and Ukraine, China, the United States in some strange sense, a weird love-hate relationship. I think it's important to recognize that there is goodness everywhere we step. And I think this is highlighted by the illustrations that I had used earlier about even on the bad road, goodness can be seen. Goodness that can be followed on our way out. So two primary paths here. Again, it's either a reiteration or reprompting where we can highlight some of the images that I had outlined earlier, or there is something a bit different about this second half of the verse. And I tend to think that there is something different, because instead of deep, we have narrow. Instead of ditch, we have a pit. In my mind, and we also have a strange woman instead of a whore, certainly there's relationships between the two parts of this verse. Strange woman isn't necessarily a whore. She doesn't sell herself for money or for a service or a good. She's just a foreigner. She has her behaviors are different probably than the collective. She doesn't integrate very well. She stands out. Strange. Okay, so let's do some work bringing this verse to life. The difference between a deep ditch and a narrow pit, in my estimation, is that a deep ditch, it may be more shallow, but certainly I think it is wider than that of a pit, a narrow pit. I suppose a ditch can be deep, but a pit seems to imply, I could be wrong, but it seems to imply something of increased depth. But this narrowness, the surface area around which that pit offers itself is much less than the ditch above, which probably means the whore's influence is much larger, but her effects not as steep, maybe, as that of the strange woman. And we have to wonder why. What is it about the foreign, and specifically about the woman, that causes us to be? I think there's an aspect of this that is meant to refer to the woman in the context or in the vision or the eyesight through which a man would see. Now, there's no reason a woman can't understand this as well. It's certainly open. But I think the relationship that one woman would have, even to a foreign woman, might be a bit different. I think the integration of a foreign woman to a society would be the same, though, despite the the presence of the traditional or typical woman, but it is because the relationship that the foreign woman has to the man, the possibility of the seed being propagated in that foreign soil, that produces the possibility for change, some interference to occur. I will say that among the strange or the unfamiliar, it is not necessarily a direct negative. I think that there are many things that are unfamiliar to me, but I would consider them to be positive. There are many things that I consider to be unfamiliar to me that once they become familiar, I view them as negative. Of this, I think we can agree that there is a degree of risk involved, because we just don't know. It is unfamiliar. It is unseen. We haven't participated with it. We don't have firm relationships. We can't really see it. It's a darkened figure. And like many things in our society today, risk and product or result seems to be a large altar these days. Many of us, whether we like it or not, go to it to sacrifice, whether it be through the paying of our taxes and the elite that we serve, that we seem to serve, and also through the corporate bodies through which we interact. I think they often ask of us these sacrifices that are quite rigid. They are we are often looking between the sacrifice between safety or security, the known, and that which is unsecure, unknown, unfamiliar. And often, because of not the true risks that the foreign has to present itself, but rather the fear of all possibilities, and even of those that are deviated well away from the likely probabilistic center, we attribute still great value, perhaps as we should, but almost we do so to an unfortunate extent, that the sacrifice is extensive. It is in excess. And that we often sacrifice this risk for safety. And with our safety, we get an aspect, perhaps an undesired aspect of stagnation and of rigidity that makes it difficult to offer good services, good products. This could be through regulation, or it could be just through corporate structure, or it could be just through relationships and general cultural norms. Of course, these things change over time. I don't mean to imply that it is fixed this way. I just mean to say that our current culture, at least the place that I inhabit, tends to move in this direction. We certainly can imagine a situation that is the opposite of this, in which the sacrifice that we are asked to give is that of safety for profound risk, and with that risk comes quite extreme consequences. It may cost us our lives, it may cost us our well-being, our family. These are quite extreme. But this is to say that this shadow figure of the woman that represents the fertile soil through which life can continue, the human soul is propagated into the next generation. The man stands at that altar. The man makes that sacrifice. The woman will be involved. one way or another. Even if she is deemed to be irredeemable by the society, if she is taken away, the child will be affected by her absence. Just the very absence of knowing, or the knowing, rather, of absence, will be enough, I think, to do damage. And that is a risk. But not of the extreme. Moving forward, I would imagine that women from different cultures, they have different behaviors, different ways in which they would discipline a child, different ideas and expectations of what is right and what is wrong. And these are subtle, too. I don't think that many people, myself included, understand all of the subtleties of their expressions. Exactly where the means and the value that they place into the world, where it actually ends up at the end. Many times, and it ought to be this way, I think, but of course we should also be prudent and decisive, discerning. But all the same, I think that there is an aspect of this experimentation with life that I think is necessary and fundamental. It comes back to this safety and fluidity versus rigidity, safety, rigidity versus fluidity and openness. Now, I think it is the case that because the foreign woman, the strange woman, enters into the society, she doesn't occupy the space as the whore. She is not she's not necessarily the one that draws us into the darkness, but it's possible. She is the darkened figure, after all. Now, I think that the narrow pit comes in because it is not as obvious as the whore. That relationship is so superficial that it's almost obvious. It's obvious that, that ditch is going to be so wide that we could just sort of stumble into it. But a narrow pit, it's hard for us to find ourselves just over something like that. It is almost as if we have to be tempted into it, called into it, invited into it. And there is a level of sophistication with the strange woman and the potential. I think the place is probably the same. That narrow pit, it's the pit of Sheol. We will find darkness in there, and that will extend through us to our children, to the community. It'll change us. It'll probably change the woman too. But again, this doesn't necessarily mean to say that the woman would be bad. But this is the scenario in which the woman presents as a narrow pit. I remember at the beginning of the Proverbs, I don't remember exactly which one it is. Perhaps I could find it quickly. In chapter 5, verse 3, "For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil." Verse 4, "But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. Lest you should ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, and you cannot know them." So, this sort of interesting image of the woman that comes in and that separates us as we are from ourselves. The virtue, the love that we have for ourselves and for others in the community, the language, the behavioral language, the cognitive language, not just the physical words that exit the mouth, but more of the cognitive language and the ability to enter into reciprocal discussion with somebody of a similar culture. This diminishes because of the strange woman. So I think I'll end this episode here. there's another verse that is coming after this one, verse 28, that has something to do with verse 27, the verse that I just finished on here. But I will continue that in the next episode. So until then.